Thank you, Theo. Good evening, everyone. It gives me a lot of pleasure to be introducing our speaker this evening, Matylda Ciołkosz, who I first met in, I was looking it up, I thought it was 2013. I don't know what's happened to time. It's actually only 2016, but it feels like a long time ago. A wonderful conference in Krakow that Matylda was an organizer of called Yoga Darshana Yoga Sadhana, which I think it was possibly could claim to be the sort of first big yoga studies conference that's ever happened. So she's really been at the forefront of the field, even though it's only 5 years ago, but obviously it's a fast developing field. And Matylda's assistant professor at the Institute for the Study of Religions at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, which is where the conference was held. And her academic interests focus on the role of embodiment in the formation and transformations of religious systems. And in her methodological approach, she combines the tenets of enactivism with cognitive linguistics and phenomenology. She's currently working on a monograph summarizing her long research on postural yoga. And actually, before I hand, I should also say that we're very excited that Matylda is now going to be organizing another conference in Krakow, and she's kindly agreed that we're going to collaborate with SOAS and the Center for Yoga Studies on that, and that's next May 2021, I think it's scheduled for, so keep an eye out for more information on that. It's about time we had another yoga studies conference, and I can't think of anywhere better to hold it. Matylda, thanks so much for agreeing to talk to us, and over to you.
Thank you very much, Jim. Just to clarify, it's going to be May 2022.
Oh, sorry, God, I've lost it. Sorry.
We all lose track of time these days, I guess. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to see such a large group. I haven't spoken to such a large group in a long time, or possibly ever, even, I don't know. Anyway, yeah, as Jim already said, I'm kind of wrapping up by finishing off a monograph research I did into modern postural yoga. And before I begin today's talk, let me briefly describe what my research was about. So basically, I examined through 3 strands of modern postural yoga, which is the yoga of TKV, the Sikachara, sometimes called Viniyoga, Iyengar Yoga, and Ashtanga Yoga in the tradition of K. Pattabhi Jois. And based on certain methodological tools I used, I wanted to show that there is a relation between the kind of embodied experience that you have during yoga practice and the way you may understand and explain certain abstract concepts. So basically, my study was based on the work of such linguists as George Lakoff, Mark Johnson. Well, he's actually not a linguist, but a philosopher. But George Lakoff, Mark Johnson, and Ronald Langaker. So these are the scholars who claim that the way we formulate concepts and also the way we use language is actually based on our sensory, our motor experience in the world. So we basically think in movement, we think in our embodied experience, and we also, the way we speak, the way we construct linguistic phrases is informed by this embodied experience. So, and this is why I decided to show how the embodied experience of yoga practice influences the way we might, or some other people might, think about certain abstract categories, such as, for example, those coming from the yoga of Patanjali. And I decided that rather than speaking about the general theme of my research today, I would go to a little side topic that emerged as I was analyzing and interpreting my data, so to say. And this theme was, or is, the relation between yoga practice and the social world, and between the way we practice, we behave, let's say, on mat, and how we act, how we interact with others off mat. And I must admit, it's not, it's just like a side theme and I hadn't explored it fully. So today I'm not going to give you any very I'm not going to give you a theory, so to say. I'd rather like to make certain suggestions and possibly ask some questions, pose some questions that we might reflect upon, not necessarily today, but, you know, like through when we think about yoga, so to say. Yeah, so this talk, I decided to divide it into two separate parts. The first part, hopefully shorter, will be a little bit of a review of the history of yoga. And the second part will be actually focused on modern yoga practice. And why I want to briefly, very briefly, look at certain, instances of yoga, let's say, in the past is that I'd like to, but well, when I was actually reading, when I was, you know, preparing like the background for my monograph, I realized that there is a certain pattern in the way yoga, let's say, manifests itself throughout centuries. And, you know, to say that yoga was always, you know, immersed in some social context would be, you know, trivial. But what I've realized that we can attempt to interpret yoga as a kind of a way of negotiating the social order, or maybe negotiating the boundaries between the social order and the individual order, because between the social obligations and one's alternative choices, so to say. And I'm just going to, I wanted to just make this point by giving a few examples. Can you see the, oh yeah, now it should be, now the slides should be visible. Are they visible? Excellent, thank you. So yeah, I'm going to go through some things that you've probably read about or heard about on numerous occasions. So if I'm, you know, at risk of being slightly tedious, perhaps. So of course, the first, you probably have, you know, aware through reading some books, such as the excellent Roots of Yoga that Jim here co-authored. That's, you know, very often when we talk about the yoga of the, not necessarily the yoga of the Rig Veda, because we can't really talk about that, but about certain phenomena that are similar to what later became yoga. In the Rig Veda, we have this very enigmatic figure of the Keshin. So it's seemingly, there's this hymn from the 10th mandala of the Rig Veda that talks about these figures, the hairy ones, the Keshins, who seem to be, seem to not exactly fit in the society at the time. So as we know, the Brahminic society of that time was, you know, divided into these four social groups, and of course the priests or the Brahmins were responsible for holding these elaborate rituals on fire altars, involving, of course, you know, recitations and burning oblations in the fire. And these rituals were, of course, of great importance, because basically it was believed that this was what actually kept the world together. They were necessary for the world to basically remain and continue. And of course, they were also a way to assure personal welfare and ultimately, you know, communing with gods in Svarga, in some sort of, let's say, heavenly abode. And so, of course, these ritual practices were extremely important. But it seems there was a group that used a sort of an alternative practice. So it seems that, of course, these people, these men, were in many ways similar to later ascetics. They seem to have been naked, covered in dirt. They had unkempt hair. they seem to be involved in some maybe ascetic practices, possibly vows of silence. There was some speculations about that. But also they seem to have been involved in some practices of a meditative, visual nature, in which they experienced flight. It seems that the Kashins, they flew through what was called the middle region, the Antariksha. So it was like somewhere between, let's say, the earth, the domain of humans, and the heaven, the domain of gods. And when flying mystically, during these practices, meditative practices, they experienced being entered by gods, being ridden by gods, actually befriending gods. There was some kind of an experience of a contact between the gods and the Kashins. So I realized that, of course, this is just an interpretation. This is not like a fact or anything, but I realized we could think about it as just an alternative way of actually communicating with gods, instead of doing rituals on the fire altars. You can actually perform these alternative practices and contact gods immediately at the time of these practices. And of course, here we have this fancy drawing that I did some time ago that is trying to explain this idea in this schematic context, in which, we have the Kashin moving through his practices. A Kashin moves to this middle region, experiences being here, and somehow communing directly with gods. And of course, so this is before yoga. This is about a group of people who are resemblant of later yogis. But for the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip that case. But and of course, another very important context, and this is a context where the word yoga actually appears explicitly, ultimately, is the context, is Padishadic context. So we know that there was a time that there was already an idea of attaining liberation from a cycle of rebirths. And this group of people, let's say, that whose beliefs and whose practices are described in the Upanishads, were these people dissenting from the Brahminic social order in order to become these renouncers who engage in their own practices. And these practices were, of course, there's this famous concept proposed by Mircea Eliade decades ago, the concept of ritual interiorization. That's probably very familiar for you. So the idea that instead of performing rituals externally on the fire altars, you can perform them within your own body. And instead of sacrificing oblations to the fire, you can actually sacrifice your own breath. You can kind of sacrifice your own physiological practices. So anyway, there's an idea that you can, let's say, draw your own all your efforts or your activities into your body, and perform certain practices within your body. And through this interiorization, you can attain the state of gods, now understood very specifically as attaining some kind of either identity or proximity, identity with or proximity to Brahman, this absolute principle, right? So the idea was to, let's say, through practices of breath control, of introspection, to experience the realm, the transcendent realm within. And this is something I found very interesting, because this is the situation in which you leave the Brahminic social order to choose an alternative, but instead of going somewhere outside of this order, you go within. Within you form a separate group, and you seek liberation from the world, from existing world, but including the social world, by going inside, by going into your body, and kind of going, further on. So I will return to this theme of interiorization in a moment, but going even further, there's this. This is a lovely example, but I'm afraid I'm going to have to skip it because of for the reasons of lacking time. But oh yeah, and then when it comes to kind of removing yourself from the social order and social obligations and the social space altogether, it seems to me that there's nothing as radical in this context as the yoga of Patanjali and the notion of liberation that's described in the yoga of Patanjali. So probably many of you are familiar with this model of that's presented well in Sankhya and then also then in yoga of Patanjali, of there being these two distinct principles, Prakriti and Purusha. And while Prakriti is evolves into everything that exists, including the material world, including our own mentality, everything that's phenomenal, so to say, that's Prakriti. And the other principle would be Purusha, which is just simply consciousness. Purusha is passive. Purusha is entirely different from this realm of Prakriti. This is just consciousness par excellence, some kind of absolute total identity. And as we know, the practice is there's this primordial link between Prakriti and Purusha. And Prakriti, all Prakriti is for, it's basically an instrumental domain that's there only for the sake of liberating Purusha. And as the yoga, according to the Patanjali Yoga Shastra, is being practiced as the ultimate aim of these practices is attained. We know that Prakriti, as an entire domain, is just removed from the field of experience. The only entity that remains is Purusha, and this final stage of liberation of Purusha as the sole entity is called Kaivalya, which can be translated as onlyness, sometimes isolation. So what turns out is like the entire world, the entire phenomenal world is simply removed from the view, and the only entity is the single Purusha. So this is just removing the social context so much that it can't be done anymore. It's and this seems to be like an essence of the effects of yoga practice according to Patanjali. So by introspection, by going deeper and deeper in through yogic practices, through analyzing our own mentality, we're supposed to go so deep in that we actually deconstruct everything to the point of there being nothing but Purusha, which I find is a fascinating concept. And the last one example I'd like to go to when it comes, because I think this is also, to me, it's an intriguing example, is the example of Hatha Yoga as a practice. And here I'm going to be super nervous because Jim is here, who is, of course, an expert, especially on Hatha Yoga. But I hope I'm not going to say anything ridiculous. So there's this tradition of practices that started developing, like emerging around 11th century, and went on until the 18th century, and then started transforming even more. That when it comes to interiorization and to focusing on, let's say the inside instead of the outside, you also can't go in terms of physicality here. Maybe you can't go much further because this is a system in which we have this entire model of anatomy or physiology that is the rationale for the practices that are performed. And the Hatha practices are oriented at controlling the inward, basically controlling physiology, the controlling of the movement of the vital breaths, of the pranas, or the prana and the pana, controlling of the movement of this substances, these vital substances, such as bindu and associated with semen, or such as amrita, this essence of immortality. There's also, of course, this notion of kundalini, this divine energy that can be controlled through controlled within the body through certain embodied practices. And so these practices are oriented on the inside of the body, construed in a specific way, in a quite a literal sense. And the thing is that this model of the body and this understanding of this physiology, this mystical, let's say, physiology, is very strongly correlated with the particular practices that were done by these ascetics, these yogins. And these are practices that, for example, the names of the practices are such as mudra, bandha, or kumbhaka, which I think the terms themselves are very interesting because they seem to all imply some notion of containment, right? Mudra is a seal, bandha is a bond, some way of binding, right? Kumbhaka is a pot. So even when we think about the literal meanings of these practices, they bring about the notion of, kind of containing something inside. And of course, these practices also, as we know, they're literally aimed at containing certain, let's say, substances or certain energies within the body by locking up, its orifices, by engaging some certain muscles. So Hatha Yoga is basically, and then of course the main, or one of the main goals of the Hatha practices are preventing the loss of bindu, preventing the loss of semen, and of course, also preventing the loss of breath in some sense, right? So there's this notion of controlling your bodily processes in order to not allow any, not allow certain substances that you want to keep within to go out, right? And this is something that might make one reflect also how this relates to this, let's say, social position of these Hatha practitioners, Hatha ascetics. And of course, one thing that we know is that usually, in these different Hatha texts, there were recommendations for how these practices should be performed in special places, especially, for example, especially designed huts somewhere in remote places, or generally there's a suggestion appearing very often that one should remove themselves to a desolate place in order to do practices. So that kind of makes sense. You lock yourself away from society to lock yourself up within the body. But something that I found really fascinating, and this is something that that really puzzles me, is and once again, what I'm giving here is just some not random, but sorry, some kind of interpretation. So on the one hand, we have these practices that are so much oriented on let's say the internal. On the other hand, we know that this group of Hatha ascetics started at a certain point forming orders. that started grouping together. And of course, we know that these groups were responsible for the development of the entire, let's say, current, and they produced some text on Hatha Yoga, etc. But we also know that at certain point, they started taking the role of mercenaries. They know there were itinerant orders. I mean, these orders actually, of course, exist until today, who at certain point gained quite significant power, even like economic power. So they would control trade routes. They would actually form some alliances, if I may use that word, with local kings. And it is said that at certain point they were actually a threat to the East India Company. So it seems that these groups of people were at certain point they really gained power. They gained economic power. They gained some sort of well, perhaps authority is not the best word, but so kind of on contrary to this notion of internalization, they became very out there, so to speak, colloquially, and this is something that's really, it's really interesting in terms of I don't know, motivations. And I started, and it seems that while on the one hand, separating from society, being removed from society, of course, gives you this freedom to explore alternative practices, probably also gain certain skills. Of course, focusing strongly on embodied practices was definitely, had an effect on certain skills and capabilities of such practitioners. When these Hatha practices were combined with other, athletic or martial practices that they could actually have a set of skills that could be a skill set that could be very useful when dealing with the real world. So it seems like the initial separation from society and actually the letting go of certain social norms and social obligations gave these groups of people the capacity to develop another skills and other capacities that they could take out back to the society and actually have an impact on the way the society worked and was shaped. And actually, when I was thinking about this a few years ago, I even thought about how there is this trope, even in popular culture, of somebody leaving the society in order to inure themselves, to practice, to gain new skills, and then return to the society with this new skill set that gives them more power. I started wondering whether this history could be interpreted, of the Hatha Yoga orders could be interpreted in that way. But yeah, so what I was trying to maybe show through these few examples is that there's this possibility of maybe thinking about the history of yoga in terms of how different groups kind of moved within the society, negotiated the relation to the society, maybe chose some sort of alternative to the social order they were immersed in. And very often this was mediated by practices of an embodied nature that involved focus on the body, on the internal, in some notions of isolation and isolation from the external, environment and from the social context. And with these ruminations in mind, I'd like to move to the second part of this of my presentation, which is not 100% a continuation of what I just said, but it's related to it in many ways. So at some point I started wondering to what extent? I mean, that's one thing that it is quite obvious also that, you know, yoga practitioners do form certain groups. We could say more generally that form this cultic milieu that might, in different ways, promote some kind of alternative lifestyle, sometimes alternative systems of beliefs. And this is quite an obvious thing to say. Of course, I'm using the term cultic milieu to kind of indicate this is a group. This was a term that actually Elizabeth de Michaelis used in relation to modern yoga. That this is a group of a very loose affiliation and varying degree of involvement, and we can have more radical members of the group or less radical members of the group. But this is one thing, but another thing I started wondering about is something on a much smaller scale. I just started reflecting on how the way we practice yoga, modern postural yoga, in yoga halls, might reflect certain social patterns, might reflect certain way we relate to the people around us, on mat and also off mat. Well, as I told you before, I studied in my research. I studied three strands of yoga, three schools, three lineages of modern yoga. I'm going to start off with talking about two of them, and if there's time, I present the third one as a kind of contrast because it's very, very different, I believe, from the two. So I'd like to talk about Ashtanga Yoga of K, Pattabhi Jois, and Iyengar Yoga. And I assume, because these are two very popular systems, that probably many of you know them, are familiar with them, quite familiar with them. So in many ways, I might be referring to the knowledge you already have. So starting off with Ashtanga Yoga of K, Pattabhi Jois, a very popular system of practice, although now perhaps slightly disgraced, and some people actually chose not to use Pattabhi Jois' name anymore. But anyway, Ashtanga Yoga as a system that, well, it originated in Mysore, as we know, and is a system in which well, practitioners basically practice 6 series of postures. They practice them gradually, so starting with the first series, and after the first series is perfected, the second series can be practiced, and then elements of each series are being added gradually. So practitioners usually end up practicing the very same postures in the very same arrangement 6 days a week, year by year by year. Sometimes it really takes decades, like almost a decade for a person to finish even the first series, right? And the sequence is, of course, performed. I would say it's performed as a single piece with no rest between postures. So it's performed as a whole, is accompanied by audible rhythmical breathing. And also each posture is accompanied by what's called drishti, so by fixing one's gaze on a single point. So of course the scope of vision is very limited. One thing I also should probably point out, because it seems relevant, that the system created by Pattabhi Jois and now continued by his grandson Sherlock Jois is a very centralized system, we know. So there is a center now on the outskirts of Mysore that doesn't really have a complex network, where basically instructors who want to be authorized as Ashtanga Yoga instructors have to come to be authorized in Mysore. So there's no outsourcing of that. So it's very centralized. There's a strong motivation, obligation to come to practice in Mysore. And yeah, the practice, the way it's performed the way I described it, and of course it's Ashtanga Yoga Shalas, as many of you probably know. In Mysore and outside of Mysore, usually the postures are performed in a very crowded surrounding. So there's a situation in which each free space is occupied by a yoga mat. Usually in the traditional practice, people don't start simultaneously, but they come in on different times. So whenever somebody finishes off, there's a free spot, another practitioner comes in and takes up the spot. So it's always during the entire practice, which might, I don't know, it might take like 3 hours, for example, until everybody finishes off. Although it will be probably not much longer than 1 hour for a single practitioner. So but the space is occupied all the time. And usually, of course, it's also quite hot. It gets quite humid, and basically each practitioner has only as much space as the mat offers. There's not really going beyond the mat during the practice. And also, this is of course related to something very interesting. Usually, when you look at the way the postures are performed, they have quite a narrow stance. And this might sound like a funny thing to say, but it will make sense when I start talking later about Iyengar Yoga. So, like on this slide here, you have this photograph of Pattabhi Jois performing a posture known as Chikonasana, where his feet are probably around 3 feet apart at most. And this is a comment that's very, very common. So usually what I've noticed because I should have said that before, but my study involved mostly participant observation. So usually what I've noticed, seeing people practice, but also when I was being instructed during practice, is that you kind of keep your legs close to each other. The postures are performed in kind of a narrow stance. Also, importantly, the postures are always performed while holding the bandhas, the Mula bandha and Uddiyana bandha, so the pelvic muscles and the abdominal muscles are expected to be permanently contracted. And I realized that this contraction leads to this feeling of, I would say, great, how should I put it, well, robustness, but also compactness in the trunk, in the torso. So I would say that the body of an Ashtanga Yoga practitioner, and of course we have seasoned Ashtanga Yoga practitioners here who can comment on that, seems like a very compact body that's kind of put together at all times, that holds itself together. I called this part of the top contract and withdraw, because it seems that this is something that these verbs very well describe this experience of Ashtanga Yoga to me. Kind of, your gaze is fixed in one direction, so you don't really look at other practitioners that much, maybe accidentally. You're really focused on your breath, and you focus on the postures. Your body is really tight in a sense. I mean, it's supple still. It's mobile, but still there's this feeling of robustness, perhaps. And there's another issue I'd like to mention in regard to this practice, because this is also an interesting theme for comparison, I think, is in Ashtanga Yoga. Of course, this is a question that's been quite talked about in recent years, is the matter of manual adjustments and how these manual adjustments are performed during practice. This is something that, of course, occurs both in Ashtanga Yoga and in Iyengar Yoga. And in case of both systems, this issue has been brought up because there have been cases in both traditions related to manual adjustments that came to be interpreted as abuse. sexual abuse, but also other forms of abuse. So we talked, so both of these lineages have been talked about in this regard, but it seems to me that there are a lot of differences to be accounted for when it comes to the matter of manual adjustment in Ashtanga Yoga and in Iyengar Yoga. It seems that although, you know, there are a lot of people in a hall during practice, adjustments are done very privately. So this is a very private interaction between the instructor or assistant and between the practitioner. And actually, and I'm here quoting Karen Rain, one of the women who, I mean, the first woman who brought up openly the abuse issues within Ashtanga Yoga. She called it, she said that when she was a young Ashtanga Yoga practitioner, her experience was that of an intimate, a transfer of energy between her and Pattabhi Jois. So there was this idea of this kind of intimate, private contact that's interpreted and transferring something like energy from the teacher or the instructor to the practitioner. And the interesting thing about that is that and I remember that also from my own experience, that you only vaguely notice that somebody is being adjusted. Of course, there are people walking around and adjusting different people during practice, but you don't really bother. I mean, this is not your business. You have your own practice. You have your drishti, so you don't really notice that. So there's great, you know, privacy, I think, between the teacher and the assistant that's happening at the time. And it seems that was one of the reasons that actually these abuses went unnoticed. And I found a quote, and there were, you know, more testimonies like that, but this is a quote from Gregor Mele, who was an Ashtanga Yoga practitioner more or less at the same time. I mean, at the same time that Karen Rain was. And he said something when he found out about her being abused. He said, he commented, "This would have placed your mat about 3 meters maximum from mine." So he notices that he was very close to her during Ashtanga Yoga practice. "I am completely shocked that you had to go through all of this a few meters away from me, and I was ignorant of it." So what I'm saying is that, yeah, this is really physically very possible to just not notice what's going on a few meters from you, because everybody is so involved with their own practice, so much, so engaged, so committed, you know, on being focused on their own practice. So although you can use it as an excuse not to see things, you can also genuinely, you know, not notice, which I think is quite an important point. And I will return to that matter later on when I talk about Iyengar Yoga. But now the question I would like to ask is whether this experience of yoga practice, this experience of being very isolated in your own practice, very enclosed in your own series of postures, very privately involved, does it have any bearing on the social relations that Ashtanga Yoga practitioners might have? And this is more a question than that I'm asking, but just to give an illustration that this might be the case, I'd like to briefly talk about my observations made during my stay in Mysore when I was doing my research. So when I observe people outside of practice, they seem to be moving in the small groups and socializing in small groups. There were just these small clusters of few people. Of course, these are people from around the world, different countries, you know, so it's kind of understood that they had their previous groups of affiliations, but they were usually very small. And it was very difficult also for an outsider, such as myself, for example, to approach these groups and to enter them. And so there were these groups, and there were some people like those, you know, the free electrons, I don't know, who were kind of walking around unaffiliated. And I was wondering if it's just me and my social skills that I don't know how to make friends with these people, if this is just a case that you also they also were isolating themselves because that's their social practice. And actually, some time ago, I interviewed an Ashtanga, a long time Ashtanga Yoga practitioner who remembered her first visit in Mysore, and it turns out that her experience is very similar. She said something like this: even though there was around 200, 300 students practicing every day, I felt extremely lonely. If you're not a part of the group, you're almost like an outsider. Sharath gave me a spot at 4:15, so she started the practice at 4:15 in the morning, which is extremely early, which is fine, I don't mind, but it's very dark. And I had to walk the streets of Mysore by myself. And there's a lot of Indian boys attacking women at the time of day. And Sharat kept saying every single day, if there's a man walking, seeing a woman student, you have to walk with her. You have to support each other. But not even one person stopped for me. I was calling, can you wait for me? Can you wait for me? It was very bizarre. So it seems that this experience that I have was confirmed by another practitioner who felt she didn't yet have her own group of affiliation. She came alone. She didn't have her cluster, but it was very difficult for her to be seen by other practitioners of other groups of practitioners, because she wasn't because I feel that there are like small groups where it seems to have been closed already. And of course, there's another matter that I've noticed, and this is very specific in Mysore, that of course the everyday life is very much dependent. I mean, the practice is of course the most important aspect of the life, but it also regulates the social life. So usually, for many people, the practice sessions begin very early in the morning, or sometimes even almost at night, in most extreme cases. And this means that you have to really arrange that your lifestyle might be very, very different from a regular person's lifestyle. Like, for example, you will have to go to bed much earlier. So certain evening activities, certain social activities are absolutely out of question. And when I observe people in Mysore, it seemed that really they gave up on a lot of very typical social activities so that they can make sure that their practice is intact. So it seems to me, and as it is not a strong statement but a suggestion, that this very specific way of practicing yoga kind of bears on how people behave outside of yoga halls. And to give another example, the example of Iyengar Yoga, and this is an example that in many cases I think it's almost the opposite of Ashtanga Yoga. So probably also many of you know, being familiar with the system, that well, this is a system of practice in which well, basically practice involves series of very detailed adjustments of different body parts, establishing numerous points of focus on the within the body, and learning to move and perceive different parts of the body in a very rigorous and selective way. This is also a practice where and this practice is, well, let me first, the most important point I want to make is that this practice happens very differently from the spatial point of view. So first and foremost, Iyengar Yoga sessions for more advanced practitioners are usually, the group sessions are usually very long, from, well, 2 hours onward. If it's a large workshop, it lasts much longer. And there's an idea, well, most typically, people perform, like practitioners perform postures in synchrony while being verbally guided by instructors. And one thing, just like as you can see on this photograph of BK's Iyengar, and this is quite relevant. During the post-performance of postures, usually very wide stances are adopted. As you can see, you can compare these picture of BK's Iyengar and Pattabhi Jois of the same posture. Chikonasana is executed in a very, very different manner. And actually in Iyengar Yoga, a great emphasis is put on having straight arms, straight legs, long torso. You should expand your chest. There's a lot of this. There's this huge notion of expanding your body, extending your body, and expanding your body in on all possible directions. It's really an imperative. And like for myself, I started off with Iyengar Yoga. Then I started to become familiar with the other methods of yoga practice. So when I, for example, started encountering Ashtanga and these compact postures, it felt so very, very different. It was like an epiphany almost, that you can do it in such an extremely, such a radically different way. So first and foremost, even within their own body, the practitioner is very expansive, I should say. The other matter is that the practice itself as a process is enacted very differently in space. But first and foremost, usually there's more room afforded, and practitioners move around a lot. As most of you probably know, Iyengar Yoga is famous for using a variety of props during the practice, from small things like blocks or belts to large appliances such as Swedish bars. And you either during practice move around to get a prop, or you actually walk to a prop if it's stationary. So there's a lot of moving around during practice. So the practitioners are very free to go wherever and look for extra room, so to speak. And also a lot of time. When I realized that, you know, as I said before, the Ashtanga sequences, they seem to be performed quite promptly. It's all one piece. Whereas in Iyengar Yoga, there are a lot of intermissions. Time is taken to maybe explain certain things, to get a prop, to arrange yourself into a posture. If you're performing an asana that has, you know, 5 different props that are used, you have to arrange them. So also there's more liberty in terms of how the time is used. And another matter is the matter of social interactions during practice. So, and the matter of manual adjustments. So for example, same as with Ashtanga Yoga, during practice, instructors and assistants will walk around the hall and they will adjust people manually, or verbally or manually. But whereas it seems that in Ashtanga practice, these adjustments are done very privately. In Iyengar Yoga classes, they are often very public. So even if somebody, there are in many cases, even if a single practitioner isn't being addressed, it is said out loud so the entire group hears that, so that they can also use this clue, they can also use this adjustment. And very often, if a practitioner is observed as needing some particular manual adjustments, actually the entire class will be stopped. Everybody will be brought to watch, and this adjustment will be done publicly, so that everybody can see what's happening. So I would say the body of a practitioner in an Iyengar Yoga hall is of public domain. It's a public body. It's for everybody else to learn. And of course, you know, there are these situations sometimes when in a yoga hall there's a stage, so there will be some people on a stage that whom everybody can see, that will be adjusted manually. Certain aspects of the practice will be explained on them as dummies, quote unquote dummies. And actually, it is an anecdote from my own experience I'm going to give, and actually I was subjected to this. So this was during an event for basically there was a class that was related to therapeutic practice, and I revealed to the instructor that I have hip dysplasia. And she became very excited. She said that I have to be the patient for this class. They have to, like, I'm going to be the dummy on which some other people will be able to learn. So I was assigned as a case, basically. And at some point, and it was really a weird experience in retrospect, I was asked to lie down, to which I complied on one side. And then everybody from the group was coming to me and touching my femur, so that they can feel how my femur is, like, I mean, this, like the skin on my femurs, to feel how it's placed in my hip joint, which is, well, this is an extreme case. This maybe doesn't happen so often, but yeah, I was actually, so basically my body became a model for not only everybody else to see, but for everybody else to touch. And it seems to me, after observing years of Iyengar Yoga classes, that this is very often the case, that the body is being public. And also, of course, very often people are asked to cooperate in groups on different asanas. So they assist each other. So they manually correct each other. And this is, of course, for the benefit of the person who's performing a particular asana, but also for the benefit of the other people, so that they can learn from this experience of manipulating another body. And it struck me that these cases of manual adjustment, so, you know, in Ashtanga Yoga and in Iyengar Yoga, they have a completely different social context. As I said, a very private interaction in Ashtanga and a very private relation between the instructor and the practitioner. And here we have making the body public. And it's kind of, you know, until the question of consent came up not so long ago, it was kind of assumed as completely unquestionable and normal that once you enter a hall, you kind of, you know, donate your body for the benefit of the entire group, of the entire community. And my suggestion is that in cases of abuse in this context, this abuse might actually play out in a very different ways. Of course, it's not that, and we know that this was this case that happened, that, you know, these malpractices may go unnoticed by others, because they may be done more privately. But it seems that very often the challenge related to actually being you know, being abusive or experiencing abuse, is that the body is assumed to be made public, and whatever is done to the body is kind of done publicly and for the benefit not only of the practitioner but of the entire community. That certain things might simply go unnoticed because they are interpreted in very different categories. So you may actually see openly in front of you that somebody is doing to somebody else something that's very painful and harmful, but because it's so public, it might seem okay. Like there's this famous example given of BKS Iyengar actually manipulating somebody's shoulder, somebody's frozen shoulder, and the person being obviously publicly in pain. This would be, and of course the assumption was that was for the person's good, but his or her being publicly in pain, it seems, might be a way to actually legitimize this malpractice. So yeah, and that's starting. So as I said, a lot of freedom of dispensing with space, with time, also with other people and other bodies, seems to be something that's very typical for Iyengar Yoga practice. And I started thinking to what extent this attitude reflects on other social practices outside of the mat. And it's, for me, it's maybe slightly more difficult to put a finger on it, but this is something that I have observed throughout my years of observing this community. Usually during events, it seems to me that the groups that form outside of the outside of the yoga hall, they seem to be more inclusive. And very often you'd have this large group of, like, I don't know, over definitely more than 10 people who will just invade a restaurant, you know, find the largest table possible, or connect a few tables together, and also very, you know, taking the liberty of occupying quite a lot of space, and very easily, you know, including other people, kind of, you know, sucking them into the group. So the groups get larger and larger, and new acquaintances are met. So it seems to me that also people seem, just these practitioners who I have observed seem to be more open to kind of larger scale interactions, and easily, maybe they seem to be easily incorporating other members into the groups. Also, of course, this practice of Iyengar Yoga seems to aspire to be very, very inclusive, in the sense that, of course, because this is a practice that's aimed at, that takes pride in being very therapeutic, in having special, you know, therapy classes and special classes designed for people with different needs. So such groups as seniors will be included, such groups as people with severe illnesses will be included. And there's this assumption that this is a practice that's very healing, very therapeutic. So everybody can come in and practice according to their own needs. And I'm not saying that Ashtanga Yoga doesn't have this claim about being therapeutic and beneficial, but because of the character of the practice, of course, there are many groups for whom it will be much less available. And basically, statistically, it seems it is a practice for the kind of a more exclusive, you know, elite practice for people. Sorry, that was my cat. Practice for people maybe more, you know, more able-bodied, whereas Iyengar Yoga communities do seem to want to include people in. And also, another thing that's very interesting for me is the organization of the entire Iyengar Yoga community. Because whereas, for example, the Ashtanga community is, as I said, very centralized, and it is always people coming to Mysore in order to get authorized. Like, so it's all also kind of, you know, the community is being drawn into this one center. In case of Iyengar Yoga, there's a lot of spreading out. I mean, currently, you know, there are a lot of organizational, like, structural, maybe not organizational changes, but changes in terms of management. But well, basically, the community is, well, there is the, let's say, headquarters in Pune, Maharashtra, but still there are local organizations, so local associations, national associations in different Iyengar Yoga associations in different countries that supervise what's happening in the given country. So a lot of, you know, examinations, certifications at lower levels happen locally. So there's a lot of outsourcing. There's a lot of let's say spreading of responsibilities. So even like when you, once again, when you think about it very in terms of space, and even, you know, the notion of a network has very different, you know, kind of representation about it. So it seems like Iyengar Yoga is very much going out to the world, to these networks. And of course, going to the headquarters in Pune is a very important experience for all the practitioners, and the relevance of Pune is great, and practitioners speak very about the Yoga Institute in Pune with utmost reverence. But still, the system is kind of more spread out and more hierarchical, which once again seems to reflect this notion of just, you know, being out there and expanding, and it's extending. So yeah, this is what I'm saying more as a suggestion, and maybe something to think about, to ponder. And this is, so as I said, I probably will stick to 2 examples only, and since it's already 8:05, this is all. So if you have any comments or questions, I will be very happy to try to answer.
Thanks very much, Matilda. That was great, very wide-ranging. Obviously, I'm very pleased to see you tie in the historical with the current. And yeah, and it made me think a lot about what the historical scene that you were describing. I thought that was a very nice point about yogis shutting themselves off from society and then also shutting their bodies off from the outside world. And and I thought more about the individualization or the interiorization of ritual that you mentioned. I think you cited Eliade, but isn't Hasterman normally seen as the guy who really sort of put forward this notion of the classical renouncer being the interiorizing Vedic ritual? But I think we see the same thing going on in Hatha Yoga as well. Very much we see that as sort of interiorization of tantric sexual ritual, in particular about the union of the male and female substances within the body. And also I think we see, more broadly in the traditions of Hatha Yoga. So for example, the Shakt karmas, the cleansing practices, they're quite distinct from Ayurvedic treatments in that they're all things that you can do on your own. They're designed for the individual practitioner, so they don't have to engage with society. And of course, the Hatha Yoga, and then I can't help thinking about the big contrast with what you then talking about in the modern period, because the classical sort of Hatha Yogi from the texts and renouncers more broadly, have left normal society. They're instructed to do their practice on their own, go off to a hut on their own. Meanwhile, you're talking about these large groups of people in the Ashtanga and Iyengar studios or shalas or whatever they call themselves. Now that we've got a few questions on the slider, so I will restrict myself just to asking one, just a sort of factual question, because I wonder, I think we're all increasingly aware of how sort of neoliberalized yoga sort of teaches it as almost like a quick fix. You do your hour of yoga a week and that'll make you better for your job and more productive member of society. Absolutely opposite of being a renouncer. But because you assume that, and probably most people in the audience do know a lot about Ashtanga and Iyengar and so forth, but I'm actually quite ignorant about these things. So I wonder about whether, when they were teaching, whether they pitched the practice, whether they tried to encourage their audience, their students to be renouncers. What were they trying to say? This will make you better for society. This is going to make you a better working member of society, or did they kind of encourage students to go on retreat and separate themselves from normal society? So that's my one small question, and then we can move on to the ones on the Slido as well.
This is a very, very good question, and according to what I've established, there's also here a difference between Ashtanga Yoga and Iyengar Yoga. It seems that the Ashtanga community, and once again, I'm kind of nervous because I know I'm speaking to the members of the community here, that the notions, the recommendations towards asceticism and renouncing are more explicit. Of course, it's on, and sometimes actually, if you look at at a Yoga Mala, Pattabhi Jois' book, it's sometimes like almost anachronic what he suggests in his recommendations, like renounce social life, basically focus on your practice. And it seems that in some popular narratives, like you find on the web even, this notion of renouncing is, like adjusted to this context, is quite strong. Like, for example, one thing that comes to my mind now is like this very influential American Ashtanga Yoga instructor Kino McGregor, who somewhere in an essay she wrote, she talks about her life pre-practice, pre-Ashtanga, how she was a party girl and out there all night and having fun, and then how Ashtanga Yoga changed everything, and she just renounced all of that and now like put all of her energy into practice. And it seems to me that this seems to be the narrative that I've encountered among some practitioners. I assume there's a lot of variety, the difference in degree among practitioners, but I've seen that happen. And actually, the most extreme cases, for example, and this is something that I know from, communicating personally, like, for example, an experienced teacher, this is actually a British teacher, who leads classes every morning that start like at 5 a.m. or 5:30, who does his own practice before the classes start, because that's what he needs to do, who gets up at 1 a.m. in order to be able to practice his own stuff and then, you know, and then take care of his students. So I think this is, you know, this is a notion of, and he is a family man, but, you know, this is a notion of renunciation. You really have to kind of, you know, resign from a lot of normal activities in order to uphold this kind of lifestyle. And it's not once a week, it's every day a week. So this notion seems to be, this idea of actually, you know, renouncing, kind of tweaked to the modern context, seems to be present. With Iyengar Yoga, it's slightly different. It seems that to me that it's more, I mean, you know, when you look at Iyengar's writings, what he recommends is more of using the practice, what you also suggested, using the practice to better your social life, your family life, your interactions with, well, he refers a lot to family and the close ones. So it's more the other model. So it's a part of your life, and so also, of course, acting appropriately in social context is also a way of practicing yoga off mat. And of course, another, I didn't mention this example, but actually the example of Viniyoga is very interesting in that regard, because it is a super pro-social practice, and it's all done. Yoga is for the benefit of your social relations and for the benefit of others as your social partners. So, yeah. I think you're muted.
Myself, sorry, thanks. Yeah, it's very interesting that they have different approaches from the two of them. I like the thing about, I think I have a feeling I know who you're talking about, who gets up at 1 in the morning, but that also ties in nicely with these yogi phrases about, you know, the yogi, the day for the yogi is night for the normal person, and vice versa. So maybe, yeah, fulfilling that. Okay, great. We haven't got that much time, so I think we're already, 13 minutes past, and we can go a bit over, but we've got a few questions here, so we're not going to get through them all, actually. There's loads. And top of the hit parade is an anonymous one, so I have to read it out. Do you think the hyper-diversification of contemporary yoga practices is somehow a reflection of contemporary patterns of social connection?
Ooh, that's a tough one. I feel that's also something that might be a good way of asking, something to ask Theo perhaps, and relates to her research. But I mean, definitely if there's a relation, it's not a one-way relation. I would say it's probably more mutual. So of course there's, you know, we live in these pluralistic times, and of course, you know, we have very many diverse patterns of social interactions available. So of course, probably depending on your socio-psychological makeup, you're going to choose ultimately different practices, those that also fit your social patterns more, right? That are more comfortable for you as just a social being. And probably also there might be, you know, an influence the other way around, that you know, maybe some new ways of social interactions might be, to a lesser degree probably, inspired in a way by different practices such as yoga practice. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Now the next one on the list is another anonymous one, but it's had an upvote, so I shall read it out. How does the interpretation of yoga philosophy differ between contracted, quote marks, Ashtanga versus expansive Iyengar? I suppose that actually kind of picks up on what I said in a way, I suppose, what your answer to my question about different approaches.
Okay, so I will have to say I read my book when it comes out, because I mean it's a huge topic. This is actually what I'm trying to you know, to include in my when I'm writing about my monograph. So I'm sorry I can't really answer this right now, because it would require a very, very, very long answer with examples. But anyway, It seems that really we can see actual examples of radically different interpretations of certain concepts that do relate for this experience of the body. So yeah, the best thing I can say briefly is read my book when it comes out.
but the answer is that they are reflected. I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah, they are
more.
reflected, but I just, don't have time to explain how.
Okay, thanks. Now we have, so top of the list now, all on equal votes is Matteo. So if we can go to Matteo, that'd be great, please.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. My question for you would be, how does the link between somatosensory embodied experience and language/conceptual development inform your scholarship and perhaps also the broader field of modern yoga research?
Well, for my scholarship, it's central. It's central. It's my departure point, basically. So the way, and to explain maybe more briefly, what I did methodologically in my research is on the one hand, I took the embodied experience of different systems of yoga practice that the data was my observation, but also my own practice. So I was, let's say, a participant, very participant observer. On the other hand, I took linguistic material, basically, a textual corpus related to these particular traditions. And on the one hand, I analyzed the structure, let's say, of the motor structure or the spatial structure, the tactile also structure of these practices. On the other hand, I analyzed the texts according to some rules. So there was a most of all qualitative analysis based on the suggestions of such linguists as George Lakoff was my main reference point, also Ronald Langerke. And by analyzing these texts, I realized that there are certain spatial, tactile, either metaphor or even metaphors, or even more generally some schemata that are also there in the practice. To just give you a general example, on the one hand, the experience of Iyengar yoga practice would be feeling the inside of your body in very, very minor detail, right? So feeling, so just creating this very detailed map of the inside of your body, basically that metaphorically is as granular as each and every cell. And on the other hand, it turns out that Iyengar's concept of liberation is the concept of experiencing Purusha in each and every cell. So there's actually there's a strong conceptual, relation between the two. So this is just one example. So basically, this is how it informs my research, and this is, now I have a plan to maybe in a slightly different scope apply it to a different field altogether. I think it's a good tool for the research of yoga, not only modern yoga, but because yoga is such a body, it's so much about body, right? So much about the body, the feeling of the body, and the various kinds of movement or motionlessness. So I believe this is a approach that has future in this field.
Thank you.
Great, thanks. Great question, Matteo. I think we've probably only got time for one more, I'm afraid. There's a couple of comments. You might want to look at some of the Slido sort of comments later. And I think someone might be emailing you because their question's too long. They'll be asking it that way. But if we could go to Aggie, please. Aggie Wittich, who's at the top of the questions at the moment. She's actually got two, so she might be able to squeeze both in. Let's see if they're long or not, or how long the answers are.
Yes, hi Matilda. I'll try to switch on my camera. Is it on? Well, nice seeing you. I enjoyed your talk immensely. A very short question. So a short question about this dichotomy between Iyengar and Ashtanga. You just mentioned that in Iyengar there is this very common instruction to look within or to focus within. And I was wondering, in Ashtanga Yoga, there is this group rhythm where they practice. I don't mean the Mysore style, I mean the normal class when they practice this series. So could you address this in your, yes, okay, so you got me, this public, private sphere of the body. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting point you're making about this. So, of course, in my description, I was referring to this classical, Mysore style practice, and like what happens usually when you go to and this is this is like the paradigm, the departure point, the prototypical practices, of course, where everybody practices individually. But this is true that during that each school, usually once a week, sometimes even twice a week, has these group practices, where this is another matter, the matter of doing things in synchrony. I would say that although, of course, there's this experience, well, this so-called counted series, right? When there's this teacher, instructor, who's actually counting the series, saying the names of the postures and then doing count, and everybody's moving in synchrony. So I understand that there's, on the one hand, there's this feeling of communality because everybody's moving in synchrony. But on the other hand, it's still very private. I mean, my experience, and here we can hear from people who've done it much more often than I did. Even though this practice is done in synchrony, there's just still this great experience of being kind of locked in, because you're kind of safe in your space. You have your drishti, you have the sequence that you are very familiar with. And also an interesting, and it was actually my experience, that according to your, well, usually the group sequence is always, the group series is always the first series. And of course, if you are at the level where you're performing the first series in its entirety, there's one thing. But for example, if you're not yet doing the entire series, you're still going to kind of step out and, finish on your own terms, so to speak. So you do get this element of privacy in that as well. And of course, with Iyengar Yoga, also what I was presenting is the most, let's say, prototypical case, because and this is something I was actually meaning to mention, but I didn't mention it. Here you have, we of course are encouraged, as an Iyengar Yoga practitioner is going to be encouraged to be very receptive, proprioceptive, interoceptive, to really paying attention to the inside of the body, of course. But this still very often happens very publicly, on the other hand. So there's like almost, to me, and this is a good question whether that happens with the Ashtanga Yoga practice, but my experience, and I know that you're familiar with this practice, so you can also refer to your experience and evaluate what I'm going to say, is that it's almost like the common body who's feeling this, that is feeling these things it's like supposed to feel. Even instructor gives you a clue as to what you should be feeling. It's not your, I mean, it becomes your personal subjective experience, but ultimately you're being given this experience by an instructor, and the entire class is given the same experience. So it's like sharing a body through that. So yeah, in my talk, as I said, I was referring to the most prototypical cases, and of course there will be I'm missing the word now, but like the rule won't always apply. I'm kind of generalizing, but I still feel that the counted practice, the counted Ashtanga practice, is very different and that much more inward oriented than an Iyengar Yoga practice, even though during practice the practitioners are so much focused on the inside of the body. Yeah.
Great. Thanks, Matilda. That was great. That's a nice summary to end on.